The encounter on the street. The evening air smelled faintly of oil and rain. Ethan Carter stepped out of his small garage, locking the squeaky metal shutter with the same rusty padlock he had used for years. His hands were covered in grease, the kind that never seemed to wash away, no matter how much soap he used. He was tired. His shoulders ached from bending over engines all day, and his stomach grumbled with hunger. But what hurt most was not the body. It was the silence that followed him everywhere. Ethan lived alone in a single-room apartment above a laundromat. He had no wife waiting at home, no children's laughter echoing in the hallways. His only company was the ticking of an old wall clock and the hum of passing traffic. At 38, life had not turned out the way he once dreamed. Years ago, he thought he would own a big auto shop, maybe even open multiple branches across the city. But debt, mistakes, and broken trust had reduced him to barely surviving. That night, as he walked home with his toolbox slung over one shoulder, he told himself the same thing he always did. Tomorrow will be better. But he didn't quite believe it. The city street was quiet, except for the occasional honk of a distant car and the whisper of leaves in the breeze. Street lights flickered, casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. Ethan adjusted his jacket and quickened his pace. He wanted to reach home before the drizzle turned into heavy rain. But then he heard it, a soft, fragile voice, barely louder than the sound of the wind. "If you carry me up the stairs, I'll tell you a secret." Ethan stopped in his tracks, his brow furrowed. He turned his head slowly, unsure if he had imagined it. The voice had been so faint, almost like a whisper in a dream. He scanned the street, empty. Only the glow of neon from a corner shop and the shadow of a cat slipping into an alley. Then he noticed the old brick apartment building across from him. Its entrance was dimly lit, the staircase rising steeply behind the open door, and at the bottom of those stairs sat a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Her legs were tucked close to her chest, arms wrapped around them. Her hair fell in messy strands around her pale face. She wore a faded yellow dress that looked too thin for the cool night air. Her shoes were scuffed, one strap broken. What struck Ethan most were her eyes. Bright, almost glowing in the dim light, but filled with exhaustion far too heavy for a child. Ethan blinked, unsure if she had really spoken. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice low. The girl lifted her head slowly. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, though it was fragile, trembling at the edges. "I said, if you carry me up the stairs, I'll tell you a secret." Ethan felt his chest tighten. He had no idea why, but the sight of her alone on those cold steps stirred something deep inside him. A memory, a ghost of his younger sister who used to wait for him after school with the same tired smile. His sister had passed away years ago, taken by an illness no one could cure. The resemblance was faint, but it was enough to shake him. He cleared his throat. "Where's your mom? Or your dad? They shouldn't leave you out here like this." The girl shook her head slowly. "Mom's at work. Dad's gone." Her voice broke slightly on the last word, but she quickly hid it with another faint smile. "It's just me, and I'm tired. If you carry me, I'll tell you something important. A secret only I know." Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. This wasn't his problem. He was just a mechanic, barely managing his own life. He didn't have the energy for someone else's troubles. And yet, his feet wouldn't move away. Something in the girl's voice, something in her fragile, little body shivering on the steps, wouldn't let him turn his back. He crouched down a little, keeping his voice gentle. "What's your name?" "Lila," she said softly. "I live on the 4th floor, but my legs hurt too much to climb. Please, will you carry me?" Ethan hesitated. He looked at the worn stairwell, dark, narrow, the railings rusty. 4 flights up wasn't easy, especially with someone in his arms. His back already ached from the day's work. But when Lila coughed weakly, covering her mouth with a small trembling hand, the decision made itself. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll carry you." Lila's smile widened just a little. "Then I'll tell you my secret." Ethan placed his toolbox on the ground and stepped closer. Carefully, he slid one arm under her knees and the other around her back. She was astonishingly light, too light for her age, he thought with a pang of worry. As he lifted her, he felt her small arms wrap gently around his neck, holding on, but not squeezing tight. Her head rested against his shoulder. The moment struck him harder than he expected. It had been years since anyone held on to him like this, years since he had felt needed. The staircase creaked beneath his boots as he began to climb. Step by step, he carried her upward. The building smelled of old wood, dust, and faint cooking odors drifting from apartments. Lila didn't speak at first. She simply breathed softly, her small chest rising and falling against his. Finally, halfway up, Ethan whispered, "So, what's the secret you're supposed to tell me?" Lila lifted her head slightly, her breath warm against his ear. Her voice was so faint he had to lean closer to catch the words. "You remind me of my daddy, but he never came back." Ethan froze for a moment on the staircase. The words pierced him like a blade. He looked into her wide, innocent eyes, filled with something between hope and sorrow. His throat tightened. He wanted to say something, anything, but no words came. He could only keep climbing step by heavy step with Haikir, her fragile weight in his arms and the echo of her secret ringing in his heart. By the time he reached the 4th floor, Ethan knew one thing for certain. He couldn't just walk away from this little girl's life. The hidden struggles, the old hallway smelled of damp carpet and peeling paint. Ethan's boots echoed as he carried Lila toward the door she pointed out, a faded green one with the number 42 barely hanging by a screw. He shifted her gently in his arms before knocking. For a moment, there was only silence, and then the sound of hurried footsteps. The door creaked open, and a young woman in her early 30s appeared, her hair tied back in a messy bun, her eyes wide with worry. She wore a faded supermarket uniform, the kind that carried the scent of long shifts and endless exhaustion. When she saw Lila in the arms of a stranger, her expression hardened with both fear and relief. "Lila!" she cried, rushing forward, her hands trembling as she touched her daughter's face. "You scared me half to death. What are you doing outside? I told you not to wait on the stairs alone." Her voice cracked with the weight of love and frustration all at once. Then her wary eyes turned to Ethan. "Who are you? What are you doing with my daughter?" Ethan lowered Lila carefully onto the worn couch inside the apartment and stepped back, raising his hand slightly as if to show he meant no harm. "Name's Ethan. I run the garage down the street. I saw her sitting on the steps. She asked me to carry her up. Said her legs hurt too much." His words were calm, steady, but inside he felt the sting of the mother's suspicion. He understood it. The world was not kind, and strangers were rarely trustworthy. The woman exhaled, her shoulders slumping as guilt washed over her face. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to sound harsh. It's just, things have been hard. Too hard." She brushed a strand of hair from her eyes and forced a small smile. "I'm Clara. Thank you for helping her. She has a condition. Doctors call it a chronic immune deficiency. She gets tired easily, sick often. Climbing stairs is a battle." Her voice faltered, as if every word carried the weight of years spent watching her child suffer. Ethan's gaze wandered around the apartment. The room was dim, lit only by a weak lamp near the couch. The wallpaper peeled in strips and the furniture was old and sagging, held together more by hope than strength. A small table in the corner was stacked with unopened bills, envelopes marked in red with the cold words, "Final Notice." Next to them sat a row of orange pill bottles, some empty, others nearly so. The refrigerator hummed faintly, but when Clara opened it to pour Ethan a glass of water as thanks, he glimpsed almost nothing inside. Half a carton of milk, a few slices of bread, and a jar of mustard. Clara handed him the water with a tired smile, but Ethan barely noticed. His eyes had fallen back to Lila, who now lay curled under a thin blanket staring at him with those luminous eyes. She didn't look afraid of him. In fact, she looked as though she already knew him. That unsettled him more than anything. "You shouldn't be lifting her like that," Clara said softly, sitting down beside her daughter. "She's so fragile. But thank you, truly. You didn't have to do this. Most people just walk past us, as if we're invisible." Ethan swallowed hard. He thought of how many times he had walked past others in need, keeping his head down, convincing himself their problems weren't his to solve. He thought of the emptiness in his own life and the ghost of his sister who had once whispered to him through pale lips, asking him not to leave her side in the hospital. He had left anyway that night because he couldn't bear to watch. And when he returned the next morning, she was gone. That guilt had followed him like a shadow, and tonight it seemed to stare back at him through Lila's small, tired face. "Your daughter's strong," Ethan said finally, his voice rough. "She's tougher than most people I've met." He didn't know why he said it, but it felt true. Clara laughed bitterly, though it was a laugh without joy. "Strong, yes, but strength doesn't pay for medicine. It doesn't buy food. It doesn't—" She stopped, pressing her lips together as tears welled in her eyes. She shook her head quickly, not wanting a stranger to see her break. "I'm sorry. You should go. You've already done more than enough." Ethan nodded slowly. He knew when someone was pushing back their pain, building a wall to protect what little pride they had left. He picked up his toolbox and turned toward the door. But before he stepped out, Lila's voice, small but clear, floated through the room. "Ethan?" she whispered. He paused, turning back. Her eyes locked onto his, steady and unblinking. "Don't go too far away. I still have more secrets to tell you." The door closed softly behind him, but her words clung to him all the way down the staircase, heavier than the toolbox in his hands. He walked through the night streets, his steps slower than usual. He had meant only to help her up the stairs, nothing more. Yet somehow he had been drawn into a story larger than himself, as though fate had been waiting for him on those cold stone steps. He told himself he wouldn't return, that it wasn't his place. But deep down, he already knew that was a lie. Something had awakened inside him, something he thought he had buried with his past. The mechanic's choice. The following morning, Ethan woke before dawn, though he had barely slept at all. His mattress, thin and uneven, groaned beneath him as he shifted restlessly through the night, haunted by the memory of the little girl's words. He had expected that once he left the apartment, her face would fade from his mind, just another fleeting moment in a city of endless stories. But Lila's whisper had rooted itself in him, clinging like oil that refused to wash off. "You remind me of my daddy." But he never came back. The more he thought about it, the more it struck at his chest, stirring something old and raw, something he had spent years trying to bury. By mid-morning, Ethan was back at his garage, but his mind was elsewhere. Engines roared and tools clattered, yet everything felt hollow. A customer stood before him, asking about the cost of a brake repair, and Ethan found himself staring blankly until the man repeated the question twice. Shaking his head, embarrassed, he gave the estimate, but even as he worked beneath the hood of the car, his thoughts wandered to Lila. He imagined her mother rushing to her second job, exhausted, leaving the girl alone in that dim apartment. He imagined the unopened envelopes stacked on the table, the empty fridge humming like a cruel reminder of hunger, and the way Lila's thin arms had clung to his neck as though holding on to the last safe place in the world. When the day ended and the last car left the shop, Ethan closed the shutters but didn't turn toward home. Instead, his feet carried him back down the familiar street, past the same flickering streetlights and weary storefronts, until he found himself standing again before the old brick building. He told himself he was just checking in, that he would drop by briefly and leave. Yet when he reached the 4th floor and Clara opened the door, surprise flashing across her face, he realized he had crossed a line he never expected to cross. Clara's suspicion returned instantly. Her eyes narrowed and her voice carried a sharp edge. "Why are you here? I told you last night you've already done enough." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, holding a small grocery bag he had picked up on the way. Inside were basic things: bread, milk, some canned soup, and apples. It wasn't much, barely enough to last a few days, but it was what he could afford without digging himself deeper into debt. He raised the bag slightly, his voice low but steady. "I thought maybe this could help." Clara's lips parted as if to protest, but her words faltered. She glanced at the bag, then at her daughter lying weakly on the couch. Lila had lifted her head the moment she heard Ethan's voice, her pale face lighting with a joy so pure it silenced any argument. "You came back," she whispered, smiling faintly. I knew you would. Ethan stepped inside, placing the groceries on the table. Clara didn't thank him, but she didn't send him away either. Instead, she busied herself arranging the food, though he could see her hands tremble. Pride was a heavy armor, and she wore it even when it cut her. Ethan sat across from Lila, studying her closely. She looked even more fragile in the daylight, her skin almost translucent, her small hands trembling as she tried to lift a cup of water. Without a word, Ethan reached forward, steadying it for her. She met his eyes again, and for a moment the world seemed to fall silent around them. You said you had more secrets, Ethan said quietly, his tone gentle but curious. What did you mean by that? Lila leaned closer, her voice barely more than a whisper. The secret isn't about me. It's about you. Ethan frowned, taken aback. About me? I don't understand. How could you know anything about me? She smiled softly, as if she carried knowledge beyond her years. Because Daddy told me. He told me once before he left. He said there was a man with hands that could fix anything, not just cars, but people too. I think he meant you. The words struck Ethan like a hammer. He leaned back, breath catching in his throat. He wanted to dismiss it as childish fantasy, the wishful imagination of a sick girl clinging to hope. But deep inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that her father's words, passed on through her, were somehow meant for him. Before he could speak, Lila's body shuddered with a sudden cough, her small frame trembling violently. Clara rushed to her side, panic etched across her face. Ethan stood frozen, watching the girl struggle for breath, her lips paling until the coughing eased, and she sank back against the cushions, exhausted. Clara's eyes were wet with tears as she stroked her daughter's hair. This is why I can't let people close, she whispered, her voice breaking. Because every day, I watch her fade a little more. And there's nothing I can do. Nothing anyone can do. Ethan clenched his fists, the grease still embedded under his nails, reminding him of the life he knew, the life of fixing what others thought was broken beyond repair. Engines, gears, transmissions, things others abandoned as useless, he brought back to life. And now here sat a child who looked at him as if he were meant to do the same for her. He didn't know how, didn't know where to even begin, but in that moment he made a choice. He would not walk away. That night, long after he had left their apartment, Ethan sat awake at his kitchen table, staring at his rough hands. For years, he had believed his life had no purpose beyond patching up old cars for customers who barely remembered his name. But now, Lila's words echoed in him, reshaping the way he saw himself. Hands that could fix anything. Maybe her father had been wrong. Maybe it was just a story. But what if it wasn't? What if, for the first time in years, he had been given a chance not just to fix machines, but to repair something far more broken? And as the rain tapped against the window, Ethan realized he was already in too deep. This was no longer a matter of choice, it was a calling. Breaking walls. The days turned into a quiet rhythm that Ethan had never expected to be part of. Each evening, after long hours at the garage, his feet carried him back to the apartment with the faded green door on the 4th floor. He told himself he was just stopping by, checking in, making sure the girl was all right. But each time, he stayed longer than the last. At first, Clara resisted his presence, her suspicions sharp, her words edged with pride and fear. She had lived too long carrying burdens alone to easily allow a stranger into their fragile world. Yet even pride bends when kindness proves itself genuine. Ethan didn't push his way in, he fixed the things that were broken. He patched the squeaky hinge on their bathroom door. He mended the broken leg of the kitchen chair that had nearly collapsed under Clara's weight one evening. He repaired the leaking faucet that had dripped endlessly, keeping Lila awake at night. Each act was quiet, unannounced, and without expectation of thanks. Slowly, the tension in Clara's eyes softened, the barriers she had built around her family cracking piece by piece. Lila, on the other hand, accepted him without hesitation. The moment he stepped inside, she would light up with the kind of joy that seemed too big for her frail body. She would tug gently at his sleeve, asking him to sit beside her, to listen to her stories, or sometimes simply to sit in silence. Ethan found himself drawn to her words, for Lila spoke as though she carried the wisdom of someone far older than her years. She talked about life not with bitterness, but with a strange, gentle acceptance. "People think being sick means I am weak," she told him one evening as they sat by the window, the city lights glowing far below. "But I think being sick teaches you how strong your heart really is, because if you can still smile when your body wants to give up, isn't that strength?" Ethan had no answer. He had spent most of his life hiding from pain, numbing himself with work, closing himself off from the world so he would never feel the sting of loss again. Yet here was this fragile child, speaking of pain as if it were a teacher rather than an enemy. For the first time in years, he began to wonder if maybe he had been living wrong all along. One evening, as autumn crept closer and the wind outside grew colder, Lila pulled a small notebook from beneath her blanket. Its cover was worn, the pages bent and smudged with fingerprints. She handed it to Ethan with trembling hands. "These are my letters," she said softly. "I write them when I can't sleep. Some are for Mom, some are for Daddy, and some are for you." Ethan froze, staring at her in disbelief. "For me? But why?" "Because Daddy once told me about a mechanic he admired," Lila replied, her eyes shining. "He said this man was young but had hands that could fix anything, not just cars. Daddy said he wished that man would believe in himself because he was meant for more than just grease and tools. When you carried me up the stairs, I knew it was you. You were the one he was talking about, and that's why you have to hear my secrets." Ethan's throat tightened as he flipped through the pages. The handwriting was shaky but filled with determination. Some letters were short, filled with childlike drawings of stars and hearts. Others were longer, words scratched in crooked lines but heavy with meaning. One letter in particular caught his eye. "To the mechanic who doesn't know he is more than a mechanic. You will find my daughter one day, and when you do, she will help you see yourself." His hands trembled as he stared at the page. How could your father have written this? He didn't know me." Lila smiled faintly. "Maybe he didn't know you by name, but he knew the kind of man you were supposed to be." Ethan sat back, overwhelmed. The words felt like a mirror being held before him, forcing him to face everything he had run from. He thought of the years he had wasted hiding behind broken engines and empty nights. He thought of his sister's final moments, how he had abandoned the room because he couldn't bear to watch her fade. He thought of the loneliness that had consumed him since. And now here was a girl, fragile as a whisper, telling him he was meant for something greater. The weight of it all pressed against him until he could barely breathe. He stood abruptly, pacing the small apartment, running his greasy hands through his hair. "I don't understand this," he muttered. "I don't know what you expect from me. I'm no savior. I can't fix this. I can't fix you." His voice broke on the last word, raw with frustration and fear. Clara, who had been standing silently by the sink, spoke at last. "No one asked you to fix her, Ethan. But maybe what she needs isn't someone who the question hit harder than any hammer strike." Ethan remembered his sister's voice begging him not to leave, and the way he had chosen escape over presence. He had been running ever since. Could he truly stay this time? Could he bear the weight of watching someone he cared about suffer, without breaking? Before he could answer, a sudden sound cut through the room. Lila's cough, sharp and painful, shaking her small frame. She gasped for air, her hands clutching the blanket as her chest rose and fell in shallow bursts. Clara rushed to her side, panic flashing in her eyes. Ethan stood frozen, his body trembling as memories of hospital corridors flooded back. But this time, instead of running, he moved forward. He knelt beside the couch, steadying Lila's small body, speaking softly, though his voice shook. "I'm here, kid. I'm not going anywhere. Breathe with me. In and out. Just like this. You can do it. Can take the sickness away. Maybe what she needs is someone who won't run when things get hard." Her eyes met his, steady and unflinching. "Can you be that someone?" Slowly, painfully, her breathing steadied. Clara clutched her daughter's hand, tears streaming silently down her face. When the storm passed and Lila slumped back against her pillow, exhausted, Ethan realized his shirt was damp with sweat though he hadn't moved from her side. He had stayed. For the first time in years, he had stayed. And in that moment, as Lila whispered weakly, "See, you can fix more than cars," Ethan understood that something inside him had shifted. The walls he had built around his heart were breaking piece by piece. He didn't know where this path would lead, but he knew one thing with certainty: he could no longer turn away. The secret revealed. The air in the apartment was heavy with the scent of medicine and the faint metallic tang of old radiators that hissed unevenly against the cold. Ethan sat by the small table, his arms folded, his mind circling questions he could not answer. He had stayed far later than he intended, long after the sun had dipped below the skyline and the city outside hummed with the distant noise of traffic. Clara had given up trying to convince him to go home. She busied herself with folding laundry, though her weary eyes kept flickering toward the couch where Lila slept fitfully, her breath shallow but steady. When Lila stirred, opening her eyes and calling his name in a voice weak but certain, Ethan was already at her side. He leaned close, brushing a damp strand of hair from her forehead. "I'm here," he whispered, though his chest ached with the weight of how much that simple promise meant. She looked at him with that same piercing gaze, as if she could see through every wall he had ever built. "Do you want to hear my secret now?" she asked, her voice trembling with both exhaustion and determination. Ethan hesitated, fear curling inside him. For days now, she had teased him with the idea of a secret, a truth claimed only he deserved to know. Each time she mentioned it, his pulse quickened, torn between wanting to know and wanting to run from whatever burden her words might place on him. Yet tonight, as her small fingers gripped his hand with surprising strength, he realized he had no choice. He could not deny her. "Yes," he said finally, his voice low. "Tell me." She drew in a shallow breath, her chest rising with effort. "My daddy. He used to talk about you." Ethan frowned, confusion crossing his face. "About me? That doesn't make sense. I didn't know your father." "You didn't meet him," she said softly, her words broken by a brief cough. "But he knew you. He worked at the same garage when you were just a boy starting out. He told me about the mechanic with hands that were strong but gentle. He said you fixed cars like you were giving them a second life. He always said, that young man is meant for more. He doesn't know it yet, but one day the world will need him." Ethan froze, his breath caught in his chest. Memories stirred, distant images of the garage in his teenage years, the old men who taught him how to hold a wrench properly, how to listen to the heartbeat of an engine. There had been one man, older, quiet, with kind eyes, who often watched him work. Ethan had thought little of it at the time, just another worker trying to earn a living. Could that have been Lila's father? The thought left him shaken, as though the ground beneath his feet had shifted. Lila continued, her voice gaining a fragile strength as if speaking the secret gave her life. "When he got sick, Daddy told me that if he couldn't stay, maybe someday I would find you. He said you would carry me when I couldn't walk. And you did. The night I asked you, you didn't walk away, you lifted me. That's how I knew you were the one." Ethan's eyes burned with tears he hadn't expected. He turned his face away, ashamed of the emotion breaking through the hard exterior he had worn for years. "Kid," he whispered, his voice rough, "I don't know if I'm who your father thought I was. I've made mistakes. I've failed people. I couldn't even stay when my own sister begged me not to leave her side. I'm not a hero. I'm not special." Lila reached up, her small hand brushing against his cheek, her touch so light it nearly undid him. "You stayed for me," she said simply. "That's enough." The words shattered something inside him. All the guilt, the loneliness, the weight of years spent believing he was a man defined by failure. Suddenly it all seemed to crack under the force of her unwavering belief. In her eyes, he was not the broken man he saw in the mirror. He was the one who had carried her, who had stayed, who had chosen to face the pain instead of fleeing. And maybe that was enough. Clara had been listening silently, her hands pressed against her mouth as tears slipped down her cheeks. For so long she had carried the burden of being both mother and father, of shielding her daughter from despair even when she felt hollow herself. To hear her child speak with such conviction, to watch this weary mechanic break open under the weight of her faith, it was almost too much to bear. She turned away, pretending to busy herself with the laundry again, but her shoulders shook with quiet sobs. Ethan sat there long into the night, holding Lila's hand, watching her drift into uneasy sleep. Her words echoed in his mind, a refrain he could not silence. "You stayed for me. That's enough." He realized then that he could not go back to the life he had before. The garage, the lonely apartment, the nights filled with silence, they no longer held meaning. He had been given something more, something terrifying and beautiful, a chance, say, to redeem himself, not by changing the past, but by being present now. As the city outside grew quiet, Ethan made a silent vow. He would not run this time. He would not let fear drive him away. If Lila's father had seen something in him all those years ago, if this fragile little girl believed he was meant for more, then perhaps it was time he started believing it too. Building hope. The following weeks unfolded in a way Ethan never could have predicted. The garage still consumed his days, but the nights no longer belonged to him alone. Instead, they belonged to the small, dim apartment on the 4th floor and the frail girl whose smile had become the brightest part of his existence. Each evening, no matter how weary his body felt, he carried with him not only his toolbox but something else. Bags of groceries, spare parts to mend broken things in their home, or sometimes nothing more than stories to make Lila laugh. The rhythm of his life, once monotonous and heavy with loneliness, began to pulse with purpose. He found himself working harder at the garage too, not simply for survival, but because every dollar he earned felt like fuel for something greater, Lila's tomorrow. Clara noticed the change in him. At first, she resisted, her pride bristling at the idea of a stranger becoming part of their survival. Yet as the days stretched into weeks, she began to accept that Ethan was not here out of pity. He was steady, consistent, never making promises he could not keep, never asking for anything in return. When the rent threatened to overwhelm her, Ethan quietly slipped a payment envelope beneath the landlord's office door. When Lila's medication ran low, he bartered with his customers, offering free oil changes in exchange for donations toward the pharmacy bill. Slowly, neighbors began to notice, and then customers, and then friends. People who had once passed Clara and Lila without a second glance now began leaving bags of food at their door, or dropping coins into Ethan's jar on the garage counter labeled, "For Lila." Hope, it seemed, was contagious. One evening, after a particularly long day of repairs, Ethan sat at the kitchen table across from Clara. Lila had already fallen asleep, her breathing shallow but calm. The dim yellow light overhead cast long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Clara looked at Ethan, her eyes soft but tired, and asked the question she had avoided for weeks. "Why are you doing all this? You don't owe us anything. You could walk away right now and no one would blame you." Ethan leaned back, his hands rough and stained from years of work resting against the table. He let out a breath, slow and heavy. "Because I've walked away too many times before. From people who needed me, from my own family, and every time I left, it ate away at me until there was nothing left but emptiness. I don't want to run anymore, Clara. I don't want to wake up 10 years from now knowing I failed her or you, the way I failed everyone else." His voice cracked slightly, but he did not look away. "I can't fix her sickness, but I can fight beside her, and maybe that's enough." Clara's eyes shimmered with tears, though she blinked them back quickly. She reached across the table, her hand hovering for a moment before resting gently on his. "Then fight with us," she whispered. It was the first time she had admitted aloud that she could not do this alone. From that night forward, the three of them became bound together, not by blood but by something stronger, shared struggle. Ethan began organizing small events in the neighborhood, car washes, repair fairs, anything to raise a few more dollars for Lila's treatment. What shocked him most was how quickly the community responded. People he barely knew came forward, moved by the sight of a hardened mechanic carrying a sick child up crumbling staircases night after night. Donations trickled in, then poured. Customers returned not because of discounts, but because the pauldrons. "I wanted to stand with him. In a city often drowned in indifference, a spark of humanity was reignited. Yet amidst the growing support, the battle at home was still real and relentless. Lila's condition wavered, some days leaving her with enough strength to sit by the window and chatter about dreams of visiting the ocean, other days confining her to bed with fever and weakness. Ethan stayed through it all, reading to her, carrying her when her legs refused to hold her, whispering encouragement when despair threatened to take over. Each time she looked at him with those luminous eyes and said, "You stayed," he felt his own strength deepen. He no longer doubted why he was there. One late evening, as rain lashed against the windows and thunder rolled across the skyline, Lila sat propped up against her pillows watching Ethan patch a crack in the wall. Her voice broke the silence. "Do you know what the secret really was, Ethan?" He looked up, surprised. "I thought you already told me." She shook her head faintly, her eyes glowing even in the dim light. "The secret wasn't that Daddy knew you. It wasn't even about what he said. The real secret is that you can carry people without even realizing it. You carried me up the stairs that first night, but you've been carrying us ever since. That's why Daddy said you were meant for more. Because some people fix machines, but some fix hearts, and you're one of those people." Ethan set down his tools, his throat tightening. The words hit him harder than any secret she had shared before. He crossed the room and knelt beside her bed, taking her small hand in his calloused ones. For a long moment, he could not speak. When he finally found his voice, it was thick with emotion. "I don't know if I deserve that, Lila, but if carrying you means giving you another day to smile, then I'll do it until my legs give out." The storm outside raged on, but inside something stronger was being forged. Ethan was no longer simply a mechanic patching up broken cars for strangers. He was a fighter, a guardian, a man reborn through the faith of a child who refused to let him believe he was ordinary. And as he sat there listening to Lila's breathing slow into sleep, Ethan knew this fight was far from over. The sickness was still there, the hospital bills still mounting, the future uncertain. But for the first time in his life, he was not afraid of the battle. Because he finally understood what it meant to carry someone, and what it meant to let someone carry him. The legacy of the secret, winter settled over the city with an unforgiving chill, the kind that seeped through walls and made even the strongest bones ache. For Clara and Lila, it was another season of uncertainty, another battle against fevers and doctor visits, against bills that grew higher as the days grew colder. But this winter was not like the others because Ethan Carter was there. What had once been a lonely garage mechanic trudging through life had now become the anchor that held them steady. He arrived each morning before the sun, and he left only when exhaustion pulled him home. He was there through every cough, every restless night, every quiet tear that Clara thought no one saw. And he was there through the brighter moments too. The days when Lila's laughter, fragile but vibrant, filled the apartment like music. The community had grown into something Ethan never imagined possible. What started with a jar labeled "For Lila" at the garage had turned into fundraisers across the neighborhood. Churches organized food drives. Local musicians played small concerts to raise money. Even children from nearby schools sent drawings and cards with hopeful messages scrawled in crayon. And at the center of it all was Ethan, the man who carried the sick girl up the stairs one evening and never walked away again. His story spread quietly, not through headlines or television cameras, but through word of mouth, whispered from neighbor to neighbor, customer to customer. People were drawn not to a hero, but to a man who chose to stay when staying was hardest. Yet the hardest battle still lay ahead. Lila's doctors spoke carefully, with words wrapped in caution. Her condition had reached a point where she needed a complex, risky treatment, one that required resources far beyond what Clara could ever hope to afford. Even with the community's generosity, the cost was staggering. Clara sat at the kitchen table late into the night, her head buried in her hands, while Ethan stared at the numbers that seemed impossible to reach. But Lila, fragile as she was, looked at them both with a calmness that startled him. "Don't give up," she whispered, her small hand resting on his. "You carried me this far. Don't stop now." And he didn't. Ethan worked himself to the bone, taking on extra shifts, repairing cars long after midnight, refusing to rest until every penny was accounted for. His hands blistered, his back screamed in pain, but he kept going, because every turn of the wrench, every drop of sweat, felt like a step towards saving her life. The neighborhood rallied too. Strangers became allies, each one carrying a piece of the burden. Slowly, painfully, the impossible became possible. The day finally came when Clara held the payment receipt in her trembling hands, tears streaming down her cheeks as she whispered, "It's enough. We can do it." The morning of Lila's treatment was gray and cold, but inside the hospital, Ethan felt a fire burning in his chest. He held her hand tightly as they wheeled her toward the operating room. She looked up at him with those luminous eyes that had first stopped him on the staircase months ago. "Promise me something," she said softly. "Anything," Ethan replied, his throat tight. "Promise me you'll keep carrying people, even after me, because that's your gift, Ethan. That's the real secret." Her smile was faint, but her words glowed with a truth so powerful it carved itself into his soul. He bent down, pressing his forehead gently against hers. "I promise." Hours crawled by like years as Ethan and Clara waited in the sterile hallway. Every sound, every footstep of a nurse made Ethan's heart leap. He had never prayed much in his life, but that day he whispered prayers to whoever might be listening. He thought of his sister, of all the years he had run from the pain of loss. He thought of how this little girl had found him in the darkness and given him something worth fighting for. And he thought of the promise he had made, not just to her, but to himself. When the doors finally opened and the doctor emerged, Clara collapsed against Ethan, too afraid to hear the words. The doctor's smile, though weary, was enough to break the tension. "She made it through. It will be a long recovery, but she's strong, stronger than anyone expected." Relief washed over Ethan, so powerful he felt his knees nearly give way. He held Clara upright as she wept, and for the first time in years he let himself weep too, not with guilt, but with gratitude. Months passed, and though recovery was slow, it was steady. Lila grew stronger. Her cheeks gained color, her laughter returned in fuller bursts. There were setbacks, yes, but for every step backward, there were 2 steps forward. And through it all, Ethan stayed, never faltering, never running. The mechanic who once hid from his past had become the man who faced every storm. Years later, when the neighborhood gathered at the community center Ethan had helped build, a place designed not just for repairs of machines, but for the repair of lives, it was Lila who stood at the podium. Taller now, healthier, her voice rang clear and strong. She told the story of a night long ago when a weary mechanic carried her up the stairs and into a future neither of them could have imagined. She spoke of secrets, not the kind whispered and kept hidden, but the kind that changed lives when shared. The secret, she told the crowd, her eyes shining, is that one act of staying, one act of carrying can change everything. Because when you carry someone in their weakest moment, you carry them into hope. Ethan sat in the front row, his hands folded tightly, tears sliding silently down his weathered face. He had fixed countless cars in his lifetime, but none of them compared to this. The quiet miracle of seeing a little girl he once thought he might lose stand tall, her voice filled with strength, her spirit unbroken. In her words, he saw his own redemption, proof that he had not lived in vain. As the applause filled the room, Lila's eyes found his. She smiled the same way she had on the staircase years ago, only now with the fullness of life shining through her. And Ethan, the mechanic who had once believed he was nothing more than a man covered in grease and regret, finally understood. The secret was never about fixing cars. It was about carrying people when they could not walk, staying when it was easier to run, and believing in the strength of love when everything else seemed broken. That was his true work. That was his legacy. And with that realization, Ethan Carter, once a lonely man, now a man who had carried and been carried, smiled through his tears, knowing that the secret had done more than save a little girl. It had saved him too.